Hello, everybody. This is Rico Manalo, Chief of Learner Success at All Aces Inc., back with another episode of All Aces on Air. Today, I am joined by my very special guest, Andrew Francalanza. Hi, Andrew. How are you?
Hello, good afternoon from South London. I'm well. How are you?
Doing very well. If I can introduce you just a little bit, Andrew is a diversity and inclusion lead, a conference director, and a LGBTQI plus speaker who believes that diversity and inclusion are not a tick box exercise, but a way of life. His passion and purpose is to support others in bringing their true selves to the fore, in creating inclusive and fair opportunities for all, and making a difference. After qualifying as a social worker, Andrew worked for the past 20 years in the social, not-for-profit, voluntary, and charity sectors, both in the UK and Malta, and achieved both an accredited Level 6 certificate in leading D&I and organizational culture and a Management Foundation certificate. In his spare time, Andrew is an active member of the South London Theatre and the fundraising and events coordinator of the Whatever DIY Film Festival, a low-budget and DIY film showcase for and by the LGBTQI plus community. In addition to all of those accomplishments, Andrew, I believe you have also just accepted the title of, is it Champion for Pride 365?
Yes. So it's been announced, I think, on Monday. So it's very fresh. And Pride 365 is an organization. It's part of the Interpride, which is an organization that very much supports Pride and LGBTQ plus Pride across the world in promoting diversity, inclusivity, and equality. And the Pride 365 is very much working on the idea of eliminating pinkwashing, which will explain what it is, but also in supporting businesses and organizations to make sure that their work with the pride, with their local prize, and also with the LGBT plus community is something that is continuous throughout the year. That is not just a tokenism issue, a profit excuse to mark Pride, and then once it's over, they forget about it. So it's very much a conversation with various businesses in creating further equality, diversity, and inclusion.
That's so fascinating. And I'm really interested in jumping into that a bit later, as you mentioned. Um, I think for now, we'll start with our standard questions. And it does seem, as I was reading out that intro, that you're involved with as many things in your professional life as you are in your personal life. And like, that's a
Yes,
lot, you know?
it can be sometimes. Yes.
So, I mean, typically my opening question is, what made you fall in love with what you do? And I guess I would modify my question for you. What made you fall in love with all of these different things that you do? Because it is a lot.
It is, but also like it's very cyclical. There are some things that I do on the side, like for example, the film festival that only requires a certain amount of my time throughout a certain amount of time during the year. Um, what made me fall in love with what I do? Good question. I think it it starts very much from very beginning, like the way that I was brought up from my family. From I come from Malta, which is a very small Catholic island in the Mediterranean Sea, and to put it geographically, it's literally underneath Italy and in between Italy and North Africa, and coming from such a small knit community, sort of like, and also with how I was brought up, like my family always gave us sort of like instilled the values of that everyone is equal, that sort of like treats each other as you would want to treat yourself, but also like in a way that sort of like, even though Malta was and still is very predominantly white, there was never any hatred instilled in us,
Hmm.
and so on and so forth. But also, it came also from a place of very much experiences that I lived through. Because like, even though there were these values, like I went through in my teenage years, they were very much like I went through quite a number of of bullying experiences,
I'm sorry.
and it came very much from the place where people didn't see me that I fit in that box. I was in an old boys' school, for example, and they didn't see me as I fit in the male criteria in what it means to be masculine. And that for me was always like mind-boggling, because sort of it was very much like, but even if I don't fit, if I'm different from you, why would you be horrible back? Shouldn't we accept each other? Same, for example, with my appearance. Like, I'm taller than the average Maltese person. I'm more Mediterranean than the average Maltese person. And friends used to call me, and in summer in particular, I tan quite a lot. Used to, because now I live in London, there isn't much sun. But they used to call me Mohammed, for example. And again, that was like, so why would, being that I look different from you, why would you bring an Islam Arabic connotation as if it's something that it's wrong, or sort of like something you make fun of? So
some big joke, right?
Yeah, exactly. So all these experiences, and then when I came out as well as a gay man, there was very much like that sort of like homophobia and people trying to silence me. So throughout my life, there was always like these experiences that I never understood, sort of like, okay, by being different, why am I making being so negative about it? But then as well, I started seeing the other side of the spectrum of activism, of being involved, of promoting diversity, and of creating opportunities. And throughout my career, from social work to where I am now, then a part that I fell in love with anything that is diversity and inclusive related. I also realized how much my character, my experience is really supportive of what I can do and the power that I can that I have in supporting others. But also I realize how much it's a passion and a purpose in my life. So that's why I don't mind doing it both as a professional and also on my voluntary time, because I see that I and many other people can make a difference, and there is the need to create, to support, to give opportunities, to have that conversations that I believe that I'm good at.
Well, thank you for that.
That was a very small snapshot.
That's a great snapshot. I think one thing that I'm so curious about is, well, I grew up in New Hampshire, which is an incredibly white state in the United States. Like, there are not too many people that look like me at all. And so I say all of this to relate to your story about going to an all-boys school and being identified as different, which from my own childhood experiences, I know can be quite isolating. And just in hearing your story, and from what I know of you personally, a lot of the activities that you're involved in are actually about bringing people together. And it seems like there's this thread of reaching out to invite people who might be experiencing that isolation, that I don't know if you want to call it a singleness or a singularity or something like that, but I'm just so curious about how you went from that isolating experience to being involved in so many things that bring people together. And what's that story?
I think, again, it comes very much from my background, first and foremost. Because, as I said, I come from a very small island, there's very much the sense of being a small native, that you're very close to your family, that food, for example, brings people together. And if you're having guests, irrelevant if they're friends, if they're families, if they're neighbors, you always have a table full of food, because it's something that brings people together. It's very much part of the culture as well. So I think, I'm not sure now, but when I grew up there, 97% of the residents of Malta were practicing Roman Catholic. And that in itself brings very much a sense of being together, to pray, to go to mass, to celebrate festivities. But also it's very much a local community event, because, for example, every city and every town in Malta, during summer, they organize a week-long feast, generally related to their to their patron saint. And there's so, but it's very much like there's lots of activities and events and community gatherings. So I think growing through that and then going through like, a period of isolation, of being singled out, that for myself, it didn't make much sense, because sort of like, this is not how it was, like this is not how I was brought up, this is not what the culture is.
Yeah.
Like, and I saw very much like sort of like the me versus them, or them versus me in particular, which
Yeah.
didn't particularly make sense. And that's when sort of like when I grew out of it and found people that appreciate me and respect me. That's when I realized, when I saw realized the actual power of bringing people together. And it's irrelevant if it's diversity related or not, but sort of like I always see like there's power in numbers, and
Yeah.
there's sort of like there's powers in community, irrelevant of what the situation is. And also, like, to put it in a diversity context, for example, I remember one of the very first diversity related conferences that I attended here in the UK. The message was very much that diversity bypasses flags, food, and festivities and festivals. We're beyond that. And for me that is wrong, because yes, there is more, but like, you can't create inclusivity, you can't create you can't approach diversity without the people.
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense, right? There's
And it's like, for me, diversity is very much, I always like to say that diversity for me is the fact. It's who you are. When it comes to age, gender, sexuality, religion and faith, ethnicity, ability or disability, while inclusion is the act. It's like what you're gonna do about it, how you're gonna bring to the table. So bringing the people together, for me, that's why it's important, because it's an opportunity to it's such a big opportunity to bring awareness, to share experiences, to learn from each other. It creates better ideas, and people work better together, where there is the sense of community. But also, like, it instills creativity, and there's also like the opportunity to challenge, to learn, to create better opportunities, because then there is the understanding that, like, okay, one box doesn't fit everyone, and not everyone is the same, but that is not something that is wrong. And I'm not going to judge you for being different from me, but how we're going to make this work, and how working together and being together can create a bigger picture. And I think this is very much an example of it all. Like, I'm here live from the UK, and I think 2020 really proved this, that irrelevant of where you are, it's important to be together. And I think this year in particular really showed the emphasis and the importance of reaching out, of being together, of irrelevant of where you are, who you are, and what your situation is. I think that is very important.
No, absolutely. I mean, I think you're right. We are building somewhat of a virtual table here. And yeah, just kind of reflecting on that. It's so fascinating to me that your way of addressing diversity is to open up a table, and then to invite people to sit there. And so much of our communal experience as humans does revolve around the table, so to speak, right?
It is, and I think something that's really important, that I find that really important in my role as a diversity and inclusion lead, is that sense that it is a shared responsibility, and it is a shared opportunity, and that's something everyone has to be involved. For example, I am at the moment work in study abroad,
Mhm.
and I work for a small organization that brings students mainly from the States to study and work in London and Dublin. And I'm the first one who sort of like, when the role was created, I was the first person who was recruited, and sort of like, so I had very much lots of involvement in creating what the work that we're doing. But as soon as I was recruited and I started my induction, I started meeting with different teams, there was very much a sense that was like, oh, good, you're here. Now you can do this. Now you'll be responsible for everything.
We're
Oh,
just
this thing that
giving
we're
you
having. if it's yours. I was like, no, I'm here and that's why I like to call myself a diverse and inclusive lead, because
Uh-huh.
I'm here to lead, I'm here to create the path, I'm
Right.
here sort of like to give the tools, create the conversations, but it's everyone's responsibility. And so, for example, something that I do
And
is
you
very
can't
much
do it alone, right?
no, and it will be a shame if I do it alone, because then what I'm doing is very intrinsic, while my role, and any person who works in diversity, who is involved in diversity, the idea is to create a better, fairer society, a better community for everyone. So
Right.
everyone has to put
Oh,
their
this
effort,
makes so much
irrelevant of how much they do it, how much they're involved. But everyone has to be involved.
Yeah, I mean, this is so fascinating. We run into a number of diversity, equity, and inclusion practitioners who, maybe they're the chief diversity officer, but it's a very, again, an isolating role that's often given to the one person of color or the one woman or woman of color
Sure,
in the organization, or any kind of straw that can be conceived of as diversity.
sure.
And then that person is so often kind of left to their own devices. And so not a
Yeah,
lot ends
yeah,
up happening. And we
yeah.
see what this does to people's spirits. It really crushes them, actually. It's actually quite cruel in some contexts, I would say.
It is, and I always joke that I'm my own team because I'm the only person. I'm very much sort of like, I don't. When it comes to diversity, I'm the only person who's leading on it. But
Yeah.
then I find again, sort of like when it comes to we have a diversity and inclusion committee, and I involve people. I recruit champions. I try sort of like as much as possible to promote people's stories and involve them, and also like in bringing conversations. For example, something that I do is that we started sending when I started, we started sending weekly emails about okay, this week these are the celebrations, different faith celebrations that are going on, different awareness days. But it's not just me, and that's something I always instill as much as possible. It's not just me giving you the message, like what you're going to do about it within your own team, how you're going to promote it with students. When it comes to marketing, how you're going to promote it like on our social media. So sort of like, yes, I feel that like my role is first and foremost like to create the conversations, but then I can't control how everyone brings it to the table because that is that is their responsibility. It's the same for me. It's the same. Like, don't know. Once I really heard a really good example that like we want to be in a place when it comes to diversity and inclusion that it becomes the norm, like health and safety. That
Hmm.
everything and everyone is involved and everyone is responsibility. There's the management who takes care of it, but if you're in different location, different state, different country, you still have to make sure that health and safety is at its best to safeguard the people, the clients, and whoever is involved. Same with diversity, and that's something that is really important for me because as much in my role, I'm the only person. Like I'm not there 24/7. I'm not dealing with every student. I'm not dealing with every partner. I mean, otherwise it would be if that was the situation, that would be like I'm the company and I do
Yeah,
everything myself.
right.
It's not. It's all about teamwork.
Absolutely. And it sounds like even with your diversity committee, you are doing your very best to help them to really not only follow through, but get into all of the necessary details that are so easy to overlook.
Yes.
Our main topic today is that diversity is not a tick box
Yeah.
exercise. So I wonder if we can pivot to that direction, because we all know as people who are working that it's so easy to just create lists of things to do for yourself.
Sure.
And you're trying your best to stay on top of everything while managing your life, your dog, your love life, trying to eat right, trying to get enough sleep, all these things. So how is it that we can really foreground that humanity and move from, okay, another thing just to cross off my list, to
Yes.
paying it my full attention my full humanity, my full self.
Yeah. I think that was a really good segue in itself, because I really believe that like diversity sometimes it ends up being a tick box exercise. And I see that happening a lot, especially when there isn't the right investment, and investment not just in money, because I've seen people investing in the wrong things, in the wrong examples, and I give some examples of that. But very much investment in what it is that you want to achieve, and how you're going to achieve diversity. If we're talking in the workplace, for example, how we're going to have diversity at all levels, in all relevant, if you're like the CEO or director, any levels of like how you're going to bring that, and also like in giving the opportunities and creating conversations and strategy, etc., where everyone is involved. For example, something that can be really become a tick box exercise is the diversity policy. And I've seen many organizations, and I've seen many individuals that are very much like, we've got a policy, it's fine.
Right.
It is well done for having it, but what are the next steps? The policy by itself, it's not it's not like you need more than that. It's not the only thing. So like what is from the policy, how you're gonna safeguard people? Are you creating a safe space within the organization? Are you having conversations to create better opportunities? If you're saying that like, oh, we've got zero tolerance when it comes to discrimination and harassment, what are the practices? Are you creating awareness events? Are you creating conversations? Are you celebrating any awareness festivities? When it comes to the staff as well, are you actually giving them the right tools and the right opportunities to be themselves? Like, for example, I as a gay person, as part of the LGBT community, I've worked in organizations where very much I was like, yay, we love everyone, but sort of like, don't bring your gayness to the company. And I was
Leave it at home.
I was told myself, for example, when I remember there was like, when I started my management career, and I won an award for something I was working. Then we had like a lunch between all the who won the awards, and we had the opportunity to meet with senior leadership and give ideas. And my idea was like, why don't you work with this LGBT charity organization? Does lots of work in when it comes to recruitment, promoting how to be a better ally. And literally, this was like the assistant CEO was very much like, have you been discriminated as a gay person? I was like, not really. I was like, then why? And he was like, so why do you want to gay up our organization? And I was like,
what?
That is the basis of diversity. It's not trying to gay it up. It's about
the fact that he said gay it up. I mean, that's more than a red flag. That I don't know.
It was. I mean, it was also like many years ago, and the organization improved. But you see it like, and also like giving examples, like, unfortunately, and I've seen it like through different organizations where when it comes to diversity, sometimes people do things that's why I mentioned it as a tick box exercise. I was like, okay, we've done this, we've done that, without doing the after work.
Yeah.
An example.
Without doing the installation, it seems
No,
like.
exactly. Like, for example, I used to. There was a point in there was a particular charity that I worked for. That I was also I used to run the national LGBT staff network throughout England and Wales, and I used to love to go to other events organized by other organizations. And considering that I had like particularly like ones that had like bigger companies, to see what they're doing and take example. And there was this organization that the idea of diversity was very much like, the more prominent celebrity people they have, the better as representatives. So like, they did this event. It was a good Q&A or event, and then at the end it was like, this is what we do. We had this celebrity and this gold medalist, and we had Professor Stephen Hawking, and you see like there was like the PowerPoint, and you see that like none of them, this was like an LGBT plus event, none of them was like part of the LGBT community, and none of the work that they done was particularly diversity related. It was more showing.
Okay. Yeah, I couldn't bring up any examples that Stephen Hawking had been involved in, like unless his party for time travelers counts, which I don't know.
Exactly. And love him, and what he's done is impressive. And I'm sure I would have loved to be at that talk. Because
Yeah,
being in the same space as him, I'm sure it was fascinating. But like, you can't promote this thing saying like, hey, look how much we're diverse, just by just creating a pop culture. And unfortunately, this is happening more and more. And I see it more and more. Like, not just so like, but I don't want to be negative, but like, you see it that like, even like, for example, in my work, like classic example, I remember there was like, I was recruiting people to the D&I committee, and someone told me I'm not joining the D&I committee because I come from a middle class background, never experienced discrimination. I was like, yes, but what can you do more? How can you be more inclusive? How can you be an ally? How can you be more experienced? I can learn what others are going through.
yeah,
And sort of like sometimes, which maybe I'm veering out of the tick box exercise, but sort of like sometimes with some people, it's very much like they only do diversity wise what's important for them or what they relate to. And for me, that's much more than that, way much more than that. So I think that as I've mentioned, I think a number of times, it's very much about creating opportunities, actions, safer spaces that are important to the conversation. And also something that I find really important is, it's not if you create something like, hey, create, a racial equality program, doesn't mean that that's the end. Doesn't mean that you have achieved
right.
diversity and inclusion. That is the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
It's a constant conversation, and that's why, for me, it's something that I'm really passionate about. Because some people stall it. They're like, "Hey, we've done this. It's fine. We're good."
Right.
There's more.
This is making me think of. I remember in college, I found a really great apartment with some friends of mine, and the landlord had made all these promises that we would be getting all new appliances and things like that. We were really excited. We move in as planned. I get to my bedroom, which was off the kitchen, and there were indeed new appliances. However, they had used my bedroom to store them, so there were like
Oh wow!
brand new appliances, like the stove and I believe the fridge were in the middle of my bedroom. So not only could we not use the fridge
My
or
gosh!
the oven, but I think I had to sleep in the living room on the floor or something that first night. So, I mean, that's to me this image of tick box diversity. You've ordered all the stuff, it's been delivered, but it's not hooked up. You have maybe no idea or skill
Yeah,
of how to use it. And so, even if you've got all the pieces, it's kind of a wash.
that is such a great example, Rico. It puts it in such a practical element. That's like, it's fascinating. Yeah.
I'm glad my history of terrible apartments is coming to bear in this conversation today.
I think we've all been there, and I'm, lucky if you haven't. But yeah, it really puts it in perspective. That's like, you can. It's not about just the promising or just dumping things that you said, like in one room, without making them work.
Yeah, yeah.
And
And
that
it
is,
is so disappointing when you're excited, when you've been made promises and you're there ready and willing to do the work, but you have no leadership, nobody knows how to use the stuff. And
exactly.
actually the outcome is kind of business as usual, like just
Yeah.
kind of get on with it.
And that's why, for example, I've opened this conversation by using the diversity policy example. Because I've
Hmm.
seen it in different companies. It's like, hey, we've got a policy. You have to read it as soon as you start your job with our company, and that was it. And I was like, when you forget what it is, two is not, it's not made in practice. And also, like, it's just paper or a
Yeah,
document on your laptop. The policy
right.
is there. It's not is the one of the steps. It's not the only step, but it's there to give guidelines to start the conversation. To put giving your example, using an example of your apartment,
Uh,
it gives you the tools, but then you have to make them work.
I mean, to your point, I think that here in the US context, we've got a lot of attention on diversity, on anti racism, some more attention on advancing racial equity,
Yeah,
which is what All ACES is involved in. But nonetheless, when people say diversity here, there's connotations, and I don't know if this is the same in the UK, but there's connotations that for many people, when they hear diversity, what they might actually get from that is, oh, we're talking about tensions between white people and black people,
yeah,
right? I'm not black, I'm not white. So for me, sometimes I find myself having to push through and remind people, like, yes, there also not only are there diversity within like that broader group of black people on the whole, but there's diversity in whiteness.
mm-hmm.
There's people that are not black or white. There's diversity that is not based on skin color. And a
True.
lot of these voices get left out of conversations simply by the fact of assumption, or they're not included in that everyday definition or the connotations of that definition. So I wonder if there are parallels in the UK.
There is, and like when you're mentioning like your identity, for example, something that really it came to mind immediately, like whenever you fill in like a job application, any sort of application for volunteer work, for this or for that, there's always the equality and diversity monitoring form, for
Mm,
example. And like for example, I always get it really annoys me because it's like in the UK, for example, there's always like white British, white Irish, white Scottish, white other. I'm always a bit like, so I'm sort of like, I don't consider myself to be like white, but like, it's just like, the other. You're either one of us or you're
oh.
another. You're
Right.
another.
You're like a
And
real person,
yes,
or you're kind of not.
yes. And it's like, and I see it in many things. Like, I think something that I find quite fascinating, but also for me, it really shows how much there is still work to be done. Is I think that we as human beings as well, we have, and I'm talking in general, so like please don't take offense anyone who's listening, but many times you have this preconceived idea that like there's something is going on, you're very aware of it, but as soon as you see that something is happening, like okay, it's sorted, like an example was very much Black Lives Matters. Like this year, it was humongous around the world. Everyone was discussing it. Everyone was involved. There were protests everywhere. 6 months down the line, it's barely something that people are discussing in the mainstream media because the media moved on. The politicians are discussing other things, including COVID, and also because, and it's interesting. I'm using this example because, like for example, in the UK, it's interesting to see how things change within 6 months. Like, there is a major, and one of the major supermarkets here, that they release their holidays adverts, and they have three different adverts. One of them is about a black family, and they're very much sort of like having this online chat, reminiscing about holidays and Christmas time, and hoping that they can meet and be together, depending on the regulations. And the supermarket received endless amount of complaints about the adverts that is not representative of who people are. They're not representing me as a white person. And also there was lots of like, it was trending all over the place. For example, on social media, we're boycotting the supermarkets
Really?
because they're not representing us. They're being, and I was like, this was not the conversation we were having 6 months ago. It's interesting how we haven't, and obviously I'm talking in general, but like it's interesting how these things are still happening. So like what happened over summer, what happened with Black Lives Matter, with the whole conversation with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and many other people, it's forgotten already. And it's like, and I see that in very much, like even like mentioning holidays per se. So I know in America holidays is very much like, and in the States holidays is very much like a very used term. In the UK, I don't see it being used that much.
Oh
There's so
no.
much focusing, for example, on Christmas, and it's like, yes, it is the Christmas period, but there are um, other events, other festivities. So, like,
That's
why are
true.
we forgetting that, especially for a country that it's not particularly, like, if I compare it to Malta, like Malta is like 100% almost like Catholic, and they celebrate Christmas, which is all about the birth of Jesus. Over here, it's very much like about, it's more the materialistic side of things. So, like, why
Sure.
we're not embracing, um, the other like religion, faith, and community. An example as well that I find very interesting is, again, trying to think of examples. Like over here, for example, about 2 3 weeks ago, it was anti-bullying week. There was like lots of promotion, lots of awareness. During the same week, the government has, I'm not sure what the technical word is, but it was like quite a substantial amount of funding that was going to be given to schools to start creating anti-bullying awareness classes, and the funding was taking off during the anti-bullying week. And
Hmm.
also, like one of the shadow ministers, who there was like this full report about how what she did, how she worked with her team, was considered as bullying. Like the prime minister decided to ignore the report, stating that she is amazing, what she does is impressive, the report was wrong. I'm gonna ignore it, and actually I was praising her as much as possible. And sort of like these kind of messages and this kind of situations, they don't particularly, um, how can I say, they don't particularly give the right message of
Right.
equality and diversity. Something as well quickly, for example, like if we mentioned like the LGBT community, there's like, hey, it, there's so much more rights, there's so much more conversation, equal marriage. But then you see the reality of it all, and like more than half the countries in Europe, they still haven't like had the conversation or even like brought equal marriage um, to the law. And there are other as well countries, like this year in particular, there's been big conversations from Poland, for example, that over the last year they've introduced something like 150 LGBT free zones and cities, like where LGBT people are not allowed. Or
Really?
Hungary, for example. Um, Hungary, for example, they're working quite a lot on their policy, on the legislation, to delete equal marriage, to bring less opportunities and rights for people who identify themselves as transgender. And it's like it's interesting how there have been progress in certain elements, but then you see people, community, countries, they're like, no, this is not what we want, this is not what we believe, and they're retracting back. And it's like, that is not, obviously, maybe I live in an idealistic world, but there's not my idea of what diversity and inclusion is. It's like it's creating opportunities, not taking them away.
I agree. Yeah. I mean, there's real concern here with this new justice on the Supreme Court, Amy Coney Barrett.
Exactly, exactly.
Um, yeah. So it is very interesting as well. Like, I have not seen in response to any of these events, say, too many news stories where they're talking to somebody from the LGBTQ community to get their opinion about it. It's all very kind of clinical and zoomed out. Like, using that passive voice, like, oh, it's happening, mistakes are being made, but not by us, not by anybody else.
True.
And that lack of actual voices from the LGBTQ community, I don't know if you've got a perspective on what that's about, but some of my research is into silence
Mhm.
in organizations, and there are many kinds of silencing. There's pro-social silencing, like
Yeah.
uh, with your very close friends, right? Maybe with your significant other. If your significant other asks you an uncomfortable question, you're kind of put in an awkward position, right? Because you can tell the truth, and maybe that's not taken well. Some feelings will be hurt. Or maybe you can try to avoid hurting feelings, and in doing
Mhm.
so, end up telling a lie. So that's like pro-social silence.
Totally.
But there's also the silence that comes with repeatedly not being heard. So
Yes.
people learn if they're not listened to, if they can't break into a conversation, if somebody keeps interrupting them, then they get the message very clearly. Oh, my voice is not valued. And when that happens, especially as kids, and it can happen at any time, it's something that really gets internalized a lot. Uh,
It's always it is, and I see it in myself that I mean, um, in anything there've been like so many like messages irrelevant of my sexuality from the church, from my family. There was always like that message of like of silencing, which is really wrong, and it's really really difficult to get over and get past through it. And you see it like very much like, unfortunately, if we're discussing, for example, like queer silencing or LGBT and QI plus silencing, it's something that is been there for a long long time. So like it's so historic that like it will take much more work and much more initiatives of like to get over it. But you still see it nowadays. Like, for example, over here in the UK, there's a charity, an LGBTQ plus charity, that every year does what is called a campaign called Rainbow Laces. And it's very much about LGBT and sports, not just in that there aren't many LGBTQI plus sports people, but also like the importance that sports have within the community in when it comes to discipline, when it comes to creativity, when it comes to building, growing as a person. But there's also, inadvertently, it's also reality. Like, for example, as far as I know, football, for example, is huge in the UK and in Europe. There's still sort of like no one from within the field that has come out, because like it's very much like there's still you go to the football grounds, there's still like the homophobic chanting that is happening, and there's the fear about that. We saw it quite clear as well in Hollywood, for example, where and in all the film industry, where it's very much that and the LGBTQ community were silenced and like, no, don't discuss your sexuality, don't discuss your private life. If you're a male, let's bring a female lead as if you're going out together, because there was always promotion that like that it's not the right thing to do. Unfortunately, as well, it is happening within the community itself. In Europe, there is this organization that is fairly new. If I'm not wrong, it's called the LG, mm, Lgb Alliance. And the alliance, they're very strong in, again, it's interesting how they're trying to silence people in the community themselves. Because sort of like their focus is that like queer, lesbian, gays, and bisexuals, it's all about sexual and sex rights. It's not about gender.
okay, so
So
they're like, we don't care about the gender stuff.
no. So our rights is about who we are and who we love. It's not about the gender. So they're very much, in a way, even though they deny it, they're very much about any transgender issues and transgender rights. They're very much about non-binary people. They're against any LGBT, for example, um, LGBT education in schools,
Oh,
because the focus is very much like, hey, it's all about your identity. And they're like, no, it's not about your identity, it's about who you love, and sort of like this, what your sex is. So it's interesting how it keeps happening, and that like people are silencing each other, and I find it very harmful, because by doing so, as I mentioned, for example, like in Poland and Hungary, there's like increase like in changing of legislation. We're seeing as well a humongous increase, if we're just discussing the LGBT community. There's humongous increase in hate crime, in when it comes to discrimination. And I think I was reading like in 2019, the amount of hate crime in London, only in London, increased in a year. It increased by 55%. That is
That's
a humongous amount of
good.
like something as well is happening in the UK is Brexit, for example, and that was a big silencing factor for anyone who is foreigner like I am. And
Yeah,
actually, even the fact that they're going like they've got like it's the legislation, it's the freedom of movement, but also it's the attitudes towards people who look foreign or they are foreign. As
right.
soon as Brexit was enacted, it exploded. The amount of hate crime, it exploded. Same, for example, with Islamophobia. Whenever there is a terrorist attack, the amount of hatred that there is towards people who are Islam practicing, or they look like they are, or they look like Arab Muslim, it
Yeah,
increased so much. And that is the, I mean, there are certain things that sort of like they're important to discuss, but I think the silencing factor is so important as well, because it's not just about the person, but you silencing them to be who they are, to discuss who they are, to live their life based on who they are, and that is the danger of
yeah,
it.
and I think at multiple levels too, right? So if people are not out there looking for queer voices, then we get what? We get the corporate voice of the media.
Yeah,
We get the voice of the state. We get the voice of people who are not involved in these decisions. And so even if they're on their best behavior, they might inadvertently do lasting harm to this community of people.
they do.
Yes, and they do. We've got some comments here.
Oh,
I'd
hello.
like to pick back up on our thread for sure, because I think that's a good one. But we've got a comment from Nina Schlegel. I hope I'm saying that correctly.
Hi, Nina.
Uh, and thank you, Miles, for putting that on the screen. Kind of along those lines, how do you intentionally embed DEI as a super new group or organization with basically no money?
Yeah.
Great question, big question. What would your concrete tips for integrating that intention from the ground up? What have you seen work or not work at this stage of an org? Andrew, would you like to take this one?
It's a very good question, Nina, and thank you for that. I mean, it's interesting because like I've seen it in different organizations when there's always the emphasis on money, and there's like I've seen organizations where they focus like we have so much money to invest on diversity. I've worked for others that there was no money at all and no budget at all, and I don't think that is the main aspect of it. I think the first thing that needs to be seen is like that there's, people who are committed to start the conversation, and starting by seeing where the company is, what are their values, what is happening, what is the feedback they're receiving from staff, what are the things that are working, what are the things that are not, is the organization, what is the culture of the organization, is there like organization that is like inundated with discrimination
Mm,
and racism, or are you in a different place? So I think it's good to start from there, seeing who you are, seeing what has been done, and if there's anything that's been done. And also, I always find it interesting, sort of like to do some research in similar organizations, and sort of like, and what is the best practice?
mm,
Are there any resources that you can use? Are there any organizations that you can affiliate with? Are there any charities? There are lots of charities, for example, in the UK, that they do great work. And part of their work is that they create guidelines, accreditations, that sort of like they give you the opportunity to review what you've done, to see what needs to be done, and to from there where you're going forward. And they give you, they support you with their expertise. So like, don't be scared in looking out. And it's not like, sometimes I do it myself. I Google and research other companies to inspire myself without stealing their ideas. But also like these organizations, for example, that they give guidelines, they're very useful because they're experts or they've got expertise in their field. And it helps you so that you're not, to realize that you're not alone, to realize that there's work, again, the bringing together, to realize that there's work being done and not reinventing yourself, reinventing sort of like the wheel in a way. I think something that is really important as well is getting buy-in from people, in particular, not only, but it makes difference, in particular from senior leadership, from the board. And many people find it controversial because they go like, oh, but they're not the most diverse. That is a separate conversation. But intrinsically as human being, and you see it in everything, in media, in politics, in pop culture, intrinsically as human being, we get inspired by our leaders. We agree or disagree with them. So like, or we're on the fence. So if there is the buy-in from senior leadership, they're promoting diversity, then it's inspirational and it cascades down. But then also by cascading it down, then people start getting involved and it works along the whole process. Because diversity is not top down or down up. It's everywhere, sort of like as working as a team. And I think that's a good placement to start. I mean, something that, for example, organizations as well do that find us fast, that I find supporting it, of support, like for example in the UK, we have very much the idea of staff networks. When it comes to creating the opportunity for different identities, LGBT and Black and people of color, disability, and also giving staff the power to meet together, to be together, to create the conversation, to challenge the conversation with senior management. And also with the very much that it gives the company the opportunity to have multi-level conversations, so that it's not, as Rico was mentioning, it's not just this is what we're doing as a corporate organization coming from the top, but this is what the organization is doing to work together. I think sort of like if you take those, there's so much more, but I think those are very much like the basis from where you can start.
Yeah, I think that was an excellent answer, Andrew. The only other thing that I would mention is if there's something concrete like some core values that the company follows, aligning everything to those core values or coming up with core values can be a really great guiding set of things to have. I know that for all ACEs, I'm always going back to our values. Am I embodying client care? Like, am I maintaining respectful boundaries between myself and the client? Am I being a playmaker? Am I making decisions when they need to be made? Am I providing collective care? Am I providing space for others to receive care so that I can also receive care?
Okay.
So it's a great clarifying tool that can be referred back to by anybody at any time and can be a huge help in getting everybody onto the same page, especially if one of the values is something like practice what we preach.
Yeah.
So if I am not practicing what I preach, I know that I am not in alignment with my own values, all ACE's values. And so that gives me the opportunity to kind of reflect and get back in alignment. So that was a really great question, Nina. Andrew, if it's all right with you, I'd like to address the next question we have, and we can go a little bit over time just so we can hit our last point as well, if that's all right.
Okay. I'm here. I'm available.
Great. And Miles, could we have that, please? Thank you. From Alexis. Thank you both for creating this space. Well, you're very welcome, Alexis. Thank you for coming. As a sales development representative for a nonprofit tech bootcamp that focuses on serving the underserved, how should I approach company representatives like HR folks or hiring managers that don't seem to fully grasp the depth of what diversity is? Alexis, this is a fantastic question. Thank you so much for
It's so
asking.
important. So important. It's a good question, and yes, there is very much. I've seen it myself in many of my roles that I did. I think it's very much in starting from a ground understanding of sort of like of what you want, what is important, and what you want, sort of like where do you want to head, and don't be scared, even if there is very much a big debate on conversation. Don't be scared in starting small. So because diversity and inclusion is such a big encompassing arena, but don't be scared in focusing on one particular issue, on one particular um, conversation. I always found that organizations they really value what other organizations are doing. They really value best practice. They really value research. They really value what is happening. And in a way, sometimes I played the game, which is really not the best situation, but I played the game for example, you're in this particular field, hey, look what others are doing. How about implementing these steps, for example? Training, learning, and development is always helpful as well, because sometimes people are not reactive, or they're a bit dismissive based on what they're not aware of.
Yes.
Or based on thinking that they know it all. So bringing that conversation, that learning and development conversation, is always important. And also, from the other side, I always find that grassroots conversation, grassroots initiatives is always. I always found that, especially with senior leadership, if they see results, it always helps. So don't be scared in creating, an event, a conversation, bringing speakers, to showcase what is that you want to do. And on the other hand as well, don't be scared in challenging others. And there's lots of information as well about the business case when it comes to diversity and inclusion, which at the end of the day, some people only focus on the business side, and there's so much benefit in having diversity and inclusion as part of your strategy. And you find various reports, various studies that they've proven that by having more diversity in the company, it increases productivity, it increases representation, it increases job retention, it increases the amount of profit that the company is doing, because then staff are more bringing their own self, they're feeling less stressed, there's less, obviously that's a bit difficult to define, but there's less as well, sick days, stress, there's more well-being. So it's also important to prove, to bring the receipts, as the young people say. What do you reckon, Rico?
Yeah, no, I think you're dead on. You mentioned that people like ourselves are often looking at what other organizations and groups are doing, not necessarily to steal things, but kind of in competition sometimes, but also, well, one thing we're trying to do with the show is to create better connections between our peers in the space, because once we can start sharing these ideas more freely and more easily, we'll all be in much more powerful positions to challenge the kind of thinking that you're encountering, Alexis. So yes, Andrew, you're right. A lot of people are looking at the business case for diversity, and that's an interesting story in itself, because at first people really latched onto it and then moved away from the business case, but now it's back. And yeah, if we've got really huge companies that are doing some great things for their employees in terms of their programming, and those are really easy to point to, right? You can easily find reports and things, as Andrew mentioned, and show those differences over time. But there's a lot more anecdotal evidence out there as well. So there might be people that are connected to the people in HR or hiring managers that you might be able to know and create some opportunities that way, right? But a lot of this diversity stuff, as Andrew has mentioned several times, is about, I wouldn't say like working up the courage, but finding your voice, using it, and finding the community that can help to build you back up after you've maybe flown too close to the sun, you know. And that is part of the beautiful thing about this line of work, in my opinion, is that there are just so many amazing people that you can connect with once you really kind of embrace being in community with others. So thank you both, Nina and Alexis, for those excellent questions. Happy to follow up in the comments with some resources. The last thing I wanted to touch on with Andrew, it very much gets to that corporate side of things that we were talking about, and kind of is a segue from the queer silencing, but the topic of pinkwashing, which a lot of people have not heard of before. So Andrew, if you could, would you please explain?
Yes.
And why is it a problem?
Yes, so with pinkwashing, there's two definitions. There's one that is very much that, an organization or a country that they're not particularly LGBT plus supportive. They sort of like, they try to promote what they're doing as like, hey, we're like, basically they disguise themselves as like they're proactive when they aren't, to promote their product. But what I want to discuss and bring to the table is very much the idea of pinkwashing, of using pride, as we mentioned before, of LGBTQ plus pride, as a marketing opportunity to make profits. So basically, it's very much the idea of like, hey, let's rainbow wash ourselves, jump on the bandwagon for Pride Week, Pride Day, Pride Month, and then ignoring the rest of the year. And that is sort of like where the conversation is at the moment, because it's very much like, with everything, including the LGBTQI community, diversity and inclusion is not just something that you do once and that's it, or something to benefit from, but it's something that is like an ongoing conversation. And you see it, just to give a ludicrous example, there is, for example, a food company that is very popular in the UK and Europe. I'm not mentioning the name so that they don't sue us. But for example, but if you Google it, you'll find it immediately.
Okay.
They came up last year for 2019. They came up with like, hey, let's celebrate LGBTQ pride by creating a pride sandwich. I was like, okay, fine. Now they've used the LGBT acronym to create a sandwich, which was lettuce. The G was guacamole. The B was bacon, and T was tomato. So basically, it was like BLT plus guacamole. Nothing out of the ordinary. And it was like, and they promoted like, oh, we're LGBT supportive. I was like, are you really? And then to top that, they were like, okay, we're gonna give, and I have everything in, we're gonna give £10,000 donation to an LGBT charity. That's the equivalent of $13,000 US dollars. But then this brought lots of conversation, lots of critique. One, because it was a bit like, okay, what else are you doing? Why are you trying
to make sandwiches? What are you doing?
Why are you trying to make profit from trying to jump on the bandwagon? There was also, as a company, they work in lots of. As I said, there are quite a number of countries in Europe that are not LGBT supportive, and this organization works in these countries. So there was conversation, okay, what are you doing to support, to promote, to be an activist? And then there was also the amount of the 10,000. It felt a bit like the £10,000 donation was a bit of tokenism, because I've done my research. They make an average of £600 million profit per year.
Oh my God.
So the 10,000 is literally, the donation is literally 0.00.17 of percent of their profits. Now, it's not about the donation, but it's about what more can you do, and that's where the conversation is. You see, I was discussing this with Rico before. You see, especially like in big cities, pride is becoming such a corporate thing, which is good for the visibility. It's really exciting to see big companies, big bands, big banks, big sort of like organizations that they are supportive of the LGBTQI community. But then, what else are they doing once Pride is over? What is their policy? How they're supporting their staff? What are the things that they're creating within the community and their community sort of like responsibility. And you see the other spectrum as well. For example, there was last year there was an organization that produces washing up liquid,
Hmm.
and they as well were very much like we're supportive of the LGBTQI community. But what they did was they donated much more money, something like like $250,000, for example, money to charities. They sponsored. Um, I think in London Pride, for example, they sponsored the women section as part of Pride. But also they went beyond. They've done a research about families and LGBTQI community and sort of like what is the interaction, what is the support system. So they've done sort of like and they've done also community awareness. Or there is a bank that is very popular in the UK that you see over the last 2 years. Not only they improved um, their customer experience to support more the LGBTQI community, but also when it comes to their promotion, it wasn't just a rainbow logo for a month. It was very much they really implemented like our services are open for everyone. Our
Hmm.
services supported this community. We're doing this kind of charity work. We're creating these conversations, and that was the idea of pinkwashing is about. Is very much about what as a company, what more can you
Yes.
do? Because at the end of the day, with irrelevant of what is your background, what is your gender, but like the people who are the experts are the people who identify as the sort of like no. The best way I see it, the best way to learn about the LGBTQI community is to speak to the LGBTQI community. The best way to learn about ethnicity is from people from that particular ethnicity as well, not
Yeah.
from what you think is important. And and so that is very much the conversation. Sort of like what are
Yeah.
you doing on a generic spectrum other than just showing your support once a year.
Yeah. I think what I'm taking away from this conversation that we've been having, Andrew, is once again the importance of having our own voice and of building community so that we can build up the courage, the resilience, those inner emotional resources that are so necessary to speaking up. And that's so important because if we don't, then others come into our spaces, co opt our voices or where our voices could be, and then we get things like rainbow shoelaces and fancied up BLTs instead of actual engagement, actual change, actual human interaction, which I
It
think is
is. And
ultimately
it comes back to where we started, where about the
uh,
conversation about bringing people together.
yeah,
Because when you don't do that, and obviously, I mean, you can't expect that you're gonna like interact with everyone in the world. But like when you don't bring people together, and when you don't have the intersectional conversations, that's when the harm is done. Because then you act on what you think is important, on what you think. Like that my work is in diversity and inclusion. I would never, ever say that I'm a diversity and inclusion expert because there are elements of that are not part of my identity that I'm still learning, that I still need to learn, that I still make mistakes, that I still sort of like work with others to understand, to implement, to create. So that's the beauty of it. The sort of like that of learning from each other to create something bigger and better.
and on that note, thank you so much, Andrew. This has been an absolute pleasure.
Thank
If
you.
you out there watching liked what you saw, please like, please follow, please share. And Andrew and I will be happy to continue the conversation in the comments after the fact. Thank you so much. This is Rico Manalo here with All Aces on Air once again, and my special guest for today has been Andrew Francalanza. Thanks
Thank you
again,
very
Andrew.
much. It was a pleasure.